My name is Henning and I'm Integration Advisor at Rpida. The most common integrations that we do between Microsoft Dynamics and Salesforce, on the Salesforce side is the Service Cloud and the Sales Cloud, and on the Microsoft Dynamics side we support all versions. We have, as an example here today, the Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central, and we have the Finance and Operations. But we also support all versions back to the Microsoft Dynamics products that were launched from the late 80s and all the way up till today. And we are also committed to support any future versions of Microsoft Dynamics. RapidiOnline is a cloud data integration platform, which means that everything we do sits in the cloud. You don't have to install RapidiOnline of any of your servers. And when we do an integration, we have a direct transfer of data without any kind of staging, which means that we read and we write directly between the systems. And we don't have any of your data stored on any servers anywhere else than inside of your application, which is the most robust and secure way of doing integration. We support multiple endpoints, databases, and companies, which means that regardless how complex your integration is, we can support that with one and the same data integration tool, which makes it a lot easier for you. We also have a no programming approach, which means that we don't have to do any kind of programming to set up your integration inside of RapidiOnline. We don't have any kind of programming inside of Microsoft Dynamics or Salesforce either. And on the Salesforce side, it's not a big deal, but on the Microsoft Dynamics side, especially if you're running some of the older versions, it's quite important from an upgrade perspective that we don't jeopardize your upgrade path. So with the RapidiOnline, you have a very light touch model where you can go ahead and upgrade without any real impact on the integration itself. We support any data that you have inside of Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics, which means all the different tables, customers, prices, products, etc. If you have customizations, those are also supported. So the pre-configured standard integration, which is on top of the platform, consists of the following 4 components. We have the myrapidi.com, which is the cloud application, where you can do the integration, where you do the configuration, where you have your account, where you do the monitoring, and we have the Rpida connector to connect on-premise systems. Then we have the integration templates, and the templates are actually supporting complete business processes. The library is much bigger than the quote to cash I showed just before. It's pre-configured and built on best practices. They're customizable, so they're basically built in the toolbox. So even though they can be used as a template, you can customize them just as freely as if it was something you did from scratch. They are all fully documented. This is very convenient, especially when we start up the project and we capture the scope and we want to map the different fields. Using the documentation here as the starting point, where we have already done all the mapping, identified the different field types and typical actions that you need to have on the different parts of your Nava Salesforce system, is something that speeds up the process dramatically, and it gives you a very good overview from the beginning. We have the sales history extension that is an option for you. It's 3 objects that you can import into your Salesforce org. It holds the open orders, the sales history, and the payment history. It's an unmanaged application, which means that either you or your partner can modify this in any way you want. But it has been designed with Microsoft Dynamics in mind. So when you look at your data inside of Salesforce, for instance, an order or a sales history invoice, it would be the same look and feel as you know already from your Microsoft Dynamics system. Support is also included in our standard integration as part of the subscription. You can use the support to maintain your integration. So if you have smaller changes to your integration, for instance, you have a need to add additional fields or you want to apply some filters to the integration, it's something that you can do by raising a ticket with our support. It does not cost you anything extra. If you have bigger chunks of work, let's say that you want to integrate with a new app that you have imported into Salesforce, then it's something that would be quoted. Typically, it takes around 4 hours to do a new table integration between the 2 systems, so it's not very heavy. And I'm going to hand over the control to Sean.
And what I'm showing you is what the Rpida platform would look like for a customer that's logging in to work with and monitor their service. Now, the service consists of the number of transfers, the schedules that they're set up to run in, our runs and logging information, statistics, groups, connections, and I'll cover the tags in just a minute. The most important thing I want to go back to, Henning had mentioned, and when he showed the slide that shows all of the endpoints that we connect to, is we set those up as connections within your service. So for this particular demo service that I'm showing, we have connections to a couple of different Dynamics nav versions that are running on some virtual machines within our network. And we also have our connection to our Salesforce demo org. So these are very easy to set up. In particular, the Salesforce one is extremely easy. It's just the username and the password. And you specify if you're connecting to a sandbox or a production environment. And if you're using SSL, you click this test to let us know that we're connected. Once we establish the connection and we're talking to the endpoint that we want to talk to, this read design button allows us to import all of the metadata about the endpoint into the Rpida platform. And once we do that, it's immediately available to be used in a transfer. And I can show you from our Salesforce side, how easy it is just to add a custom field to Salesforce and have it available immediately to be used in a transfer to a field on the other side, whichever ERP you're connecting to. On the Dynamics, for MS Dynamics, we have a couple different ways to connect to extract and write data. And one of those ways is a straight SQL connection. These work the same ways. Once we establish the parameters for how we connect, this tells our Rpida connector what to do in order to get to the data on the endpoint. So in this case, it's the nav database itself that we're connecting to. The Rpida connector connects to it, runs in the platform, runs in our cloud platform, and that's how we know how to get the data out. The same thing here, once we test that we can connect and everything's fine, we then read the design, and the entire metadata from the demo database that I'm connected to is now available in the platform to be used when I'm configuring transfers. Likewise, in this particular demo service, we have a connection to a nav web service. This is set up exactly the same. Once we determine the right way to connect to this service, we test the connection, make sure it's okay, we read the design, and then we have the metadata from the web service available. This is really important on the Dynamics side for the different Dynamics products, because adding data and updating data, in the Microsoft Dynamics environment, we want to use the available web services or any web service that one of your partners may have created, or any existing nav web service or GP web stored procedure that they may have updated, so that we have all of the customizations available. I know a lot of people are concerned about the investment they've already made in customizing their Microsoft Dynamics ERP implementations. And this is the way that we handle very easily the customizations. Since we're at the data layer when we're doing this integration, all we need to do is make sure that we're calling the already customized functionality to manage the data inside the application. And within Rpida, we don't have to manage any kind of special code to handle any kind of customization on the Salesforce side or on the Microsoft Dynamics side. So this is a way that we handle any kind of customized environment. I mentioned Great Plains. In Great Plains, we use a connection. We can connect to a stored procedure in Great Plains, and it's the same methodology, the same platform. The connections look exactly the same. And when I go to set up a transfer, which I'll show you in a minute, I select the endpoint that I'm connecting to, and then I have access to all that metadata to use in the transfer. So I'm going to take a quick look at a couple transfers here in our demo service. And this is one I was just working on recently. I'm adding contacts from Salesforce to our NAV 2017 demo environment. Now we're doing some work in these, so you're going to see some names that don't exactly align to what I'm talking about. Specifically, we're reusing some fields in Salesforce. But when we set up the transfer, the first thing we do is we define which way the data is moving, the endpoints it's moving between, and what our actions are going to be taking. So we're either going to be updating, adding, deleting. We have some other actions that we can take in here, and we have some other configuration flags that will direct how the systems on each end will work. One nice thing that's built into the platform here is, depending on the combinations of these flags, the way we set them, we can invoke the Salesforce upsert functionality without any kind of additional programming or configuration actions to take. We just say we want to do an update, an add. We disable the destination lookup so we can save on the API calls in Salesforce. And then the Salesforce upsert functionality is automatically invoked. I also want to point out that we have a full-featured source control available here, where we can automatically, within the transfer, in this particular configuration, I'm storing a field. I'm updating a field in my source table when the record is completely transferred. So that way I don't have to go back and do any kind of cleanup. I don't have to do any kind of logging to see what was transferred completely, what wasn't transferred completely. And I'll be able to see it immediately in the source system, in this case, Salesforce. So in this particular configuration, what happens is when the record's transferred, I'm committing each one. And then when the commit is done, then I am updating a field in the source, in this case, Salesforce, to say that this record's transferred. And this allows us to use this field in future transfers to say anything that already hasn't been processed, process it. So it's a very simple way to manage the source control about what was updated, what was not updated, what was added between these systems. We also have other features and functionality within the source control where we can actually, using that same technology, update external keys on either side depending on the direction of the transfer when the transfer is completed. So again, we don't have to go back and do some kind of two-step process where we need to update something because we know it's been transferred completely or anything like that. It all happens within the one transaction. There's also ways we specify like how these items are linked uniquely between the systems, and we have different methods of doing that too, depending on the implementation and the details that we might have to support. And this is a nice feature. You know, I didn't really introduce myself too much, but I have a CRM background. I implemented Siebel for many years, and now I've been working with Salesforce. And one of the nice things about this particular integration technology is that all of your transformations between fields are done at this field level in the data layer, using formulas and functions that are available in the Rpida platform. So I like to, you know, equate it to being able to write functions in Excel. If you can write functions in Excel, you can use this platform to do any kind of extract transform that you need to do between applications. And you know, all the extraction and transformation is done on the source side, and then we map it directly to the destination. So for this particular example, I'm moving data from Salesforce into Nav, and I'm using a Nav web service to do it because I'm actually adding records. And we want any kind of functionality in Nav to be invoked whenever we add a record, the same as a user would be doing it through the user interface. So I mentioned about the reading design and being able to have all the fields available. So I can go right into this field list and start typing a field name if I know the name, but I also have a handy tool here that I can browse the table layout. And when I look at this, this is showing me all the metadata that's already been loaded into the Rpida platform that I now have access to. So it automatically populated the Salesforce connection because that's what I'm working with, but I also can look at any other connection that I have defined. So I tend to forget the names of fields, so I'm just going to type one in here. And as soon as I start typing, I get a type ahead match. So I can pick. And if I had a particular field on the nav side that I wanted to map that to, I'm not sure I would want to map it to, so I'd probably look at the table layout again. And again, this is showing me all the data that's available for the service. I don't know the name of the actual web services. So this is a really handy feature for making customizations available in the MyRpd platform very quickly. The other thing I have access to at each transfer is I can apply any number of filters that I want to this. So I can make these transfers as granular as they need to be. And I can make them as wide-ranging and as broad as they need to be.
Sean, we have a question, which is
Sure.
the transfer that you show here. Is that how a template looks like for a transfer?
It is. It is exactly how a template looks like for a transfer.
Thank you.
So, as Henning mentioned, when the pre-configured integrations are loaded up in a new service, it's a great starting point. I'll tell you, I was a previous customer of Rpida because I was a Salesforce BA and admin with a client who was implementing an integration to Nav, and it was really nice to have these pre-configured transfers come out of the box. Like most companies, our special sauce was wrapped up in a modification to the standard best practice, made it really, really easy to modify any of the integrations and got us up and running very quickly. We weren't starting from ground zero. We didn't have to build everything, and it was nice to have examples of how everything worked. The other important feature, there's some advanced features that we would go through, with a customer depending on their particular integration needs. There's a lot of advanced features available in these transfers, so you can run some sub-transfers. You can only impact records that have a particular value on the destination side, so we can combine the filters from the source and filters from the destination. We can create like a one-to-many transfer in the case of some of the Dynamics products. If we have a value coming from Salesforce and we want that to be distributed out to a dimension code, say, we can do that within one transfer. We don't have to have a 2 or 3 step process to make that happen. There's a lot of functionality in here that allow us to move this data the way it needs to be moved for each individual requirement. I think there's another, is there another? Okay. So there is one question here. I just want to address one question, the formula in the address field. So this is interesting because in Salesforce, if you're familiar with it, this address field that they have in Salesforce is a particular type of field that is native to Salesforce. So what we need to do in order to pull out the individual pieces of the address so they get written correctly to the individual address fields in Nav, we use the formulas. In this case, it says, find me the part of Mailing Street that had up to the space, and then find me the next piece up to the space, find me the comma, and split those things out so I can populate them into the individual fields as needed from that long text field called address in Salesforce. So I'll be happy to go over that afterwards if you have any further questions, but that's generally what this formula is doing. And as I mentioned, it's the be able to write formulas like this with these functions. It's very powerful, and it's very flexible because these are like writing Excel functions, even though some of the syntax may be slightly different, but it's very similar to Excel. It's very similar to writing functions in Salesforce also. Okay, so once we have all of our transfers defined, we then get to set these up in schedules. And this is basically telling the MyRpd platform the order that we want these transfers to run, because we will have some dependencies. For instance, having contacts related to the right accounts and customers on each side of the transfer. We want to make sure that the record that needs to be there first is there. So for this example, in this customer group, we're processing the customer transfers first. And in this particular group, for this particular example, we have them going both ways. So we have customers coming from Nav into Salesforce, and we also have accounts coming from Salesforce into Nav customers. And when we just specify we want the group to run, it runs them in this order. So depending on individual requirements of each implementation, we will set up these transfers to match those requirements. And then the schedule runs. We define how often it runs. This one is set up to run once every day. The days of the week that it will run and the times it will run. So depending on the amount of data you're moving and the volume, you can manage the load across the servers and make sure that everything has an appropriate amount of time to complete. The error handling here, the features of the error handling is very important because we are operating in a cloud platform. You could, drop a connection from a server somewhere. So I've worked with other integration tools where that requires a full restart and you kind of have to clean everything up and reconfigure everything. But this works really nicely with our source control features. So we can say if there's an error, we decide how often we want the schedule to be retried when there's an error and when we want to be notified when there's an error. So in this case, the Rpida platform will just pick up processing from where it left off. And due to the source control, we don't have to start all over. So this is really nice if you're moving 10,000 records, in an update, and something goes wrong at record 9,000, you can just start over again from 9,001. We don't have to go back, clean everything up, reprocess all, 10,000 starting from record number 1. That's a really nice feature to keep things running. And as Henning mentioned, you can set these notification intervals to be as short or as long as you want. It depends on how often you want to be notified. Another very important feature that we have in the platform, you'll see in this example, we have tags specified down here. Now these tags allow us to create one set of transfers that can then be used for multiple companies. So we define the way that Rpida is going to connect to the ERP system and which company in the ERP system it's going to be either extracting records from or writing records to. And this will allow us, I'm going to jump back to the transfers for 1 second. This will allow us to set up one transfer that can transfer customers as long as we're using the same field set and filter functionality and things like that. We can just specify which company we want this transfer to run to. So this eliminates the need to have a specific transfer built, that's only ever going to be used to transfer customers from Salesforce into one company. And we can do a lot of things with those tags. They're think of them as like variable sets that we then apply to the transfers. And when it executes, we know that the data is going into and coming out of the correct company. Now, in some cases, we will also, depending on the environment, we will maintain, if it's necessary, we can maintain a link storage in Rpida. This particular example doesn't have one set up. Sorry about that. But we will maintain a cross-reference of unique keys between the endpoints in the systems. That can then also be used in the transfers, and we have features and functionalities that allows the transfer to look up that cross-reference when needed. For instance, in order to write the correct parent account of an invoice if necessary. And again, it's dependent upon each individual requirement and how the data needs to be moved. As Henning mentioned, we also have a full-featured logging and notification capability, so we can see exactly what happened when these transfers are running, when the schedules are running. And we also have a detailed log that shows us exactly what happened. As was mentioned, it will present an error code from the system if there is an error encountered. And so this is an easy way for us to kind of retrace and see what happened during these transfers. It's also a nice method that we have. I just had a client ask if we could develop some kind of timing on how long it takes to move an extremely large amount of data. So we did it in a test environment, and we were able to just go back and use this logging facility and say, like, this is when we started and this is when we ended. And we got a good idea of how fast we're going. On the dashboard, for each service, like I mentioned, this is what a customer would see. We can get the status of the services. It tells us all the connections, if they're running, they're up and running, and what version they're on. And I can also stop the service and restart it. And here I can also, if I choose to have schedules set up and I'm working on some of these transfers for some reason, I can delay all the schedules for a certain number of hours. So I'm not going to be consuming any of the processing power running the transfer while I'm trying to work on something else. And this is a very nice feature too, because we can just say, okay, let's stop everything for a little bit of time while we get some work done, and then we just restart it, and it restarts automatically.
How long does it take to implement the RapidiOnline solution? I made a little chart here of what it typically takes. If you are on Dynamics GP, NAV, or 365 Business Central, it's typically around 4 to 8 days, everything included from our side. So it can be a very slim process. It can be quoted on time and material as a fixed price. If you are on AX or Dynamics 365 for finance and operations, the normal quote to cash implementation typically takes around 10 days. AX and finance and operations are slightly more complex to do the integration with, and that's why it takes a little longer. So, but it's only due to the higher complexity in the application itself. You can get a quote for this that includes everything you need. All you need to do is to ask for a session with Sean or me, and then we will during that call identify your requirements, and we will send a written quote to you afterwards that is outlining exactly the project for your integration requirements.